Hello, hello.
Hello, I'm here.
Yes, perfect. Hi, Tony, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the second half of our first day of the conference. It's a 15th annual Biotech and MedTech and Biopharm PPM conference. It's actually a 2-day long conference as you're used to. We're so very excited because this is the last virtual conference. I cannot wait to meet you all in person next year in Basel, in Philadelphia. We've got many wonderful things planned. But before all of that happens, we're here and we are here with all the wonderful speakers and panelists, and we've got case studies, we've got keynotes, we've got panel discussions, and Tony's here to actually deliver one of those. It's gonna be a biopharma case study on building a resource demand and capacity planning function in a new company. Tony's here as a director of resource demand and capacity planning for Organon. So we're very honored and pleased to have you here as one of our wonderful speakers. And it's a great honor, as I said. And I'm just going to give you the word. I'm not going to keep anyone else waiting to actually hear you speak. So thank you so much. And everyone, this is Tony Dibitz.
Great, thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. Let me just arrange my screens here. Great, so I'm super excited and grateful to be here today. Really appreciate the talks so far. So much of what I've heard really resonated either with my current or my previous experience. So I guess, really appreciate everybody sharing. So as Katie said, I'm Tony Dibitz. I'm the Resource and Capacity Planning Lead for Organon Research and Development. And today I'm going to share a little bit of my experience to date in establishing a resource management capability in a new company. So my agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to provide a brief introduction and background. Then I'm going to share the approach that I've taken to get to this point in establishing this work, and then wrap it up with some of my learnings and observations along the way, and hopefully a little bit of Q&A time at the end. So in order to share this journey, it's probably important for me to give you some context. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Organon, since we're a new company and not many people may know our history, because we were just launched in June of 2021, so we're about 5 months old. We are a completely independent spin-off of Merck with a vision for women's health to be a better and healthier every day for every woman. Our business is driven by over 60 medicines across 3 areas of focus: women's health, established brands, and biosimilars. And we have about 9,000 employees supporting over 140 markets. So now a quick disclaimer up front. I know my topic says a new company in the title, but we're probably not what you'd think of as a new company with such a large footprint and an established portfolio. But I'm sure that this story is going to resonate regardless of company age or size. Just to highlight a few of our early activities for Organon to show some of our focus and where we're looking to grow. We've so far acquired a medical device company focused on postpartum hemorrhage, entered an agreement for a preterm labor candidate, and launched a website on fertility. Just a little bit about me. I was with Merck for over 20 years before joining Organon. I started in a variety of engineering roles, then morphed that into project management, which morphed to portfolio management and strategy realization, and along the way came resource management. And I've been bouncing back and forth between those last 4 bullets for probably the last 15 years or so. And in terms of the resource management piece, I've done it actually in 3 different, some are part of my role in 3 different organizations now, spanning about 6,000 employees across both research and manufacturing organizations. So that's a little bit of background. And now I need to provide a little timeline history to show how we were formed, as it's really relevant to the story of our approach. So in February of 2020, Merck announced the intent to spin off women's health, biosimilars, and legacy products. And the premise was Merck had been focusing on certain therapeutic areas, but there was this whole other group of great products that were frankly suffering from some lack of attention. So the intent was to split the companies, remove a lot of the complexity, and ultimately allow for better operational focus for both companies. And another very key important intent of Organon's formation was to focus on the unmet needs in women's health, including fertility and contraception, as well as the many other areas and diseases that disproportionately impact women. And so I think those two messages, meeting women's health needs and also unlocking the full value of our brands, was what started to get people really excited about this idea of Organon. So that was February 2020. And then along the next several months, the CEO was named and the leaders were named. And so it kind of cascaded on down. And by November of 2020, most of us who were coming over from Merck were named. And that was where my journey with Organon and this role began. We knew at the time that we were marching to what I'll call our training wheels period in February of 2021, where we were operating independently, but still leveraging Merck systems, processes, and infrastructure. So just trying to make sure that things work before we were kind of completely separated. Then we formally separated in June of this year. And just to note, we still do have many agreements in place with Merck, since it will take a while to completely disentangle these two companies. And excited to note that just last week, we announced our third major business deal, the intent to acquire Forendo Pharma, which is a clinical stage development company with a number of candidates focused on novel treatments in women's health. So it's been a busy time, a very exciting time, and what I would characterize as a bit of good chaos, with new teams forming, establishing a culture, and standing up a new company. So what you've seen so far was what was going on with the company, but now I'm going to peel the curtain back a little bit to my world. 1 year ago, almost to the day, November of last year, blissfully unaware of what's happening with Organon, focused on my Merck job, and then boom, this opportunity kind of came out of nowhere and presented itself. And when I had initial discussions with the leadership about what the expectations and kind of the why me question, there weren't a lot of mandates in there, just some general guidelines. They said, look, you know what you're doing with resource management, leverage what worked for Merck, leave what didn't, but being mindful that you'll need to scale appropriately, because we're going to be running a much different business from Merck, especially in the research and development area. We also knew that we had a pretty good sense that we were going to be evaluating opportunities both internally and externally. So I was told to have an early focus on getting some basic predictive models in place so that when the how much will this cost questions come in, we could answer them very quickly. You also started to get some of the early cultural cues saying, let's be entrepreneurial, let's treat this like a startup, maybe break through some of the constraints that came with being a bigger company. And so, bottom line is do things a little differently. But at the same time, I found out that we'd be leveraging a time tracking system, which admittedly I was a little surprised at, because while we had really good success at Merck with our time tracking, I don't think that there are any pictures of Steve Jobs or Bill Gates in their Silicon Valley garages with a time tracking guy standing in the background. But I had a depth of experience in designing, deploying, and utilizing time tracking, and absolutely have seen the business benefits. So I was glad to see that the commitment was there for that. And then lastly, my organizational side. So it was just me plus one direct report and the potential to leverage additional contractor support down the road. But we were essentially a team of two, a team of one to start, and then I was going to be able to hire. So a very, bottom line for that is a pretty small team. So now it's November. I've just been given some basic guidelines, and after personally going through those wide range of emotions, leaving a company of 20 plus year to, wow, I get to build something in a new company, to what did I get myself into? Now I've got to think, what are my first steps? And if you know me, I'm not a ready, fire, aim type person. I kind of like to be clear on purpose and plan. So I started thinking of my approach. And we've all probably been in jobs where we've Monday morning quarterbacked and said, I would do this, I would do that. How could they have let this happen? But suddenly I was that guy and the decisions were mine. So I started asking myself, what could I do differently? This is a much different business than what we supported at Merck. So what's going to be driving our demand, and how is that going to look? Did I have any restrictions or mandates? Do I have obligations to finance? Do I have systems that I have to feed into, or processes? And I think the biggest question was just how to scale these best practices. The organization that I was coming from was larger but with less functions and the same large geographic spread across the globe. So that led me to start thinking about some of the deliverables. What are the outputs of this group? What are the fundamental outputs that a resource capacity planning function should provide? And what's realistic to do with a team of two? And therefore it's a small team, so what are the most urgent needs? And how quickly do I need to get this up and running? At what point are people going to start to say, hey, where's that? Where's this report? Where are these deliverables? I needed to understand my timeline, my time frame. And so then that led me to start thinking about my stakeholders. A lot of these functions were new to me, so I needed to understand them. I hadn't worked with groups like medical affairs or clinical in the past. And it was very early and very new. And with a lot of these functions still being developed, leaders not being named, my preferred way of working is collaborative, bouncing ideas off of each other. I love the back and forth. But in those early days, as we were just getting established, you could feel a little bit like you're on an island because you're waiting for the rest of the organization to catch up. And one final note in the spirit of that now what piece, one of the things unique to this situation is, again, yes, it's a new company, but there was a lot of continuity that we had to consider. We had products on the market still, we had work in flight that we had to keep going. So while we all came over with that intention to say, we want to simplify, we want to be efficient, we don't need these large, complex systems and processes that we had over there because we have a much more focused portfolio, it's not as easy to reconfigure the plane while it's in the air. So we had to take that into mind as we were going. So with all that as context and background, I'm now going to share what translated into activities and deliverables so far. So in November of 2020, again, I'm still going through that inner monologue, processing the change, and just letting the ideas marinate, starting to bounce off of some colleagues that I trust and, had played in this space before, and just letting those ideas marinate. Coming, officially in the role in February of 2021, still kind of transitioning my Merck role. One of the challenges was many of us had to transition our Merck activities. We couldn't just let that drop. We had to pass the baton to somebody. And so that was ongoing from that point on. As I noted earlier, we needed to start building some of those basic models right away. So we did that through a large number of workshops, where what we do is we'd sit down with the leader and their teams, give them some common anticipated scenarios and phases of just basic phases of development to estimate levels of support that they would require at those times. So it was a very rudimentary, kind of quick and dirty sort of thing based on very little real data other than our collective experience, but it was a very good starting point and wound up paying dividends. Now, in several cases, leaders were named actually within a few weeks we'd have that session. So again, it was just a very dynamic time, but we needed to get this up and running because we knew we had to have, as you saw, we already had 3 business development deals, and those all had to be evaluated. And there was also a lot of work to prepare for global time tracking. So not just the technical aspects, but all of the change management that was so critical to successful deployment of that. And as we started meeting and getting to know these leaders, a common thread started to bubble up. As these new leaders started to take over their organizations, there was a realization that there were maybe some additional resourcing needs. In most cases, leaders inherited an org structure and size that were based on assumptions and estimates of others. And we started to see some potential gaps, either to meet some needed capabilities that weren't there yet or to match some higher than expected volumes of work. So I was facilitating these discussions to collect and aggregate and analyze these needs. And this has been an ongoing conversation. And the interesting thing is, I'll say the details that we had in these conversations in September were much better and more accurate than what we saw in March. As I think in the early stages, they were very speculative. Somebody even said there's what's real and what I feel. And I think that as we've started to actually run this new machine and see what it is, that's when people felt a little bit more confident to be able to say, hey, these are some real gaps that we see. Also important to note, there was a lot of conversations in the earlier things about, the important integration between the PMOs and resource management. Our PMO, portfolio and project management team, didn't really start to form until around early May. So I was doing all this without even, having that. So important to note that it would be much later before we had like real book of business to understand our full demand, thinking about how we tie resources into portfolio. That's still kind of an ongoing thing. And I think Gio pointed that out a little bit earlier this morning. Like they're very new into this portfolio piece. And so that's kind of part of just, building this as we go. So now it's June of 2021, and we had the unenviable task of launching our time tracking system in conjunction with the company's launch. So balloons, confetti, ringing the bell on Wall Street, all that stuff, all that excitement. You've got this mix of Merck and now a large contingent of external people joining the company. And so it wasn't easy to compete for attention at that point and make sure that we had a successful launch. But because of the fact that we did a lot of change management consideration up front, happy to say that it was a pretty successful launch. So now, then fast forward, and now we're trying to stabilize some of the basics around headcount management. We're starting to socialize some of our early GTT, global time tracking reports with our leaders, get them familiar with it, see the benefits of it. And of course, most importantly, feeding all of the inputs that we've taken so far into our budgets. And again, a lot of this is very qualitative, not so much quantitative as we'd like, but these are very early goings, and that's where we're at. So that's where we are, a lot to do and think about in the last year, but we feel like we have a really good foundation for moving forward. So now what I'd like to do is share some of my lessons and observations, because what I did was I contrasted this with my experience from previous organizations within Merck and looked for some of the things that may be unique to a smaller, newer company versus the established big ones, and look for times where there were actually commonalities regardless of age and size. So let's start with the differences, what I think some of the differences are. So with this newer company, I felt that the demand was more fluid, uncertain, unclear, and that's not surprising, right? Strategies are still being formed and things like that. So when people say, hey, what are we going to need in 6 months and 12 months? Really tough to answer that question because you don't know what the work is before you. In terms of capacity, I feel like you're probably just staffed to do the work in front of you. There may not be a real bench that you might have built up over time at a bigger company. You're still hiring, so you need to be careful that you understand what's a real incremental need versus something that may actually be filled or addressed once you fully hire your organization. So that dynamicness of being in the state where you're still hiring. And again, in our case especially, you're doing this purposely to do things differently because you need to operate differently. But in the meanwhile, you still have to do them in the old way. As I said, that there's that continuity piece. So you have to ask yourself, just in the back of your head, be asking yourself, will the efficiencies that I eventually bring in remove some demand and therefore capacity from the system would that increase my capacity somehow? So you just have to be careful that you're not building to the inefficient space, knowing that eventually those efficiencies will make that need for capacity less. And then there's the role, and I liked what I heard this morning a little bit about the psychology aspects of some of what we do, because in this stage, again, you're not able to deal with a lot of data. So you're dealing with personalities, and people don't really know each other yet. You're still getting to know those personalities. So you don't know who the squeaky wheel is, the person who's going to maybe sandbag or exaggerate a little bit to ensure that they get the resources. So you just need to kind of be mindful of that as you're getting into your role. And again, with the newer company, I found myself stepping into some gaps and wearing multiple hats that maybe I didn't, where there was more delineated responsibilities in a more established company. And then just talking briefly about the approach, expectations varied, and leaders weren't coming into a well-oiled machine. So at Merck, if you have these processes and you have maybe a new leader come in, and they kind of might ask, hey, why do we do it this way? Why do we do it that way? And they say, trust us, it's just always done this way. And the tweaks may come and so forth, but generally speaking, not wide variety in terms of changing things whenever a new leader comes in. But here we had all new leaders with all different perspectives, differing experiences and everything. So it was a little bit more, I'll say looseness in terms of just what the expectations are around resource management. A lot more judgment calls at this stage versus actual data, because you don't have a lot of data yet at this point. Maybe your systems are new, your organization is just building and so forth. And you may need to wait for functions to mature, meaning that as we went along, there were certain times where if I had tried to build an algorithm too early for a particular organization, they're probably not even running that way at this point. They just wouldn't have known enough at that time to be able to do that. So those are just some of the key findings that I, reflecting that were different between my experience at Merck in a big company versus, the newer Organon. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what were the same. What do I find the same regardless? In terms of the demand, I think it's important to understand the sources of demand. I mean, it's fundamental 101, but I think that it's really important to understand the different sources of demand and understanding how reliably predictable they are and for what time frame. Because I would have some systems and other roles where they would say, "Oh, this is a great predictor for the next 3 to 6 months," which is good and it has its place. But when I'm asked, "What are we going to need 2 to 5 years out?" they're not so helpful. I think that demand, what I've reflected on is it's always fluid. You know, we always see change. Programs come in, programs go out. You know, new opportunities are always presenting themselves. So I think that fluidity is always there. It's just in terms of capacity, I think greater understanding of true capacity is going to enable more informed decisions. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of times leaders, having worked with a lot of them, there's a tendency to maybe at times hoard resources and try to keep things for, I heard earlier, you know, the pet projects, the skunk works. You know, that's real, and leaders at times, you know, because maybe they've been burned and they want to make sure that their organization is appropriately sized, so they're going to keep things close to the vest, which you kind of understand to a point. But when you're looking for flexible pools of resources and trying to understand and make sure your resources are truly being deployed to the most critical, most impactful projects, it limits your ability to do that if too much of that is kind of already earmarked your capacity. The approach, models and assumptions are always going to require refining to evolve with your business. You know, these things change all the time. No matter how stable it is, things just seem to evolve, maybe a little bit more so with a smaller company, but I think that you're always going to be refining. I think it's a great practice to always continue to refine your models. I think a value that you can provide is being that neutral party and driving the common approach, making sure that we're not responding to the squeakiest wheel all the time or the loudest voice. And having a process to address changing resource needs. You know, again, the resource needs are always going to pop up. So, you know, one of the challenges I had seen was where we had 2 times a year, you could kind of ask for resources, and that's just not dynamic enough, even in the larger, kind of more stable companies. And then, you know, 2 just very basic outcomes that I think of where I feel like resource management provides value is making demand capacity gaps as visible as possible, as early as possible. I think if there's one thing that I hope to do, it's to be able to share that with leaders so that they can plan appropriately, not when once it's here and it's upon us and we say, oh shoot, we don't have the people to do this. But if we can say, hey, 6 months from now, we see this coming. So then we can, you know, use some proactive, fully informed, data-driven resource decisions. Are we going to prioritize this work? Do we have to delay it? Do we have to augment our resources? But something so that we can anticipate that ahead of time. And so just some takeaways and next steps. So first, what am I planning to do next for this organization? So it's clear that we need to, you know, we're 5 months in, and we need to stabilize our foundation for the resource management, meaning understanding what our targets are for 2022, making sure we're clear on those, aligning some of our system data. We have some things that, you know, again, part of an artifact of being a new company and transitioning some systems over, we need to fix some things there. And again, while it's still very dynamic and there's so much growth in the organization, we really want to make sure that we establish a monthly resource reconciliation process. We're working hard to understand our demand. So again, working with Geo in the portfolio management group and the function and the other functions to understand all of our known and anticipated demand, so that we can understand what may be changing in the future, so that we can, you know, start to build some real models around that work. And then just, you know, at the end of the day, extending our predictive horizon. I'd like to drive the goal is to always drive to a more quantitative system-based analysis of our needs. I find that when we're trying to convince finance or a group like that of some needs, it goes a lot better when you have real data to support that assertion that you need additional resources. And just a few takeaways. What I found is big, small, old, new. I think the fundamentals are generally the same in resource management. I interestingly, as always, thinking of this presentation and going back through some of my old notes, I was looking back at some slides I did 10 years ago in the same area, and much of the messaging was generally the same, scarily so. And that's not because I'm stuck in a rut and I'm one-trick pony. It's just truly that's a lot of the basics of our resource management come into play there. I think how you're going to get there is going to depend on sponsorship, organizational size, organizational complexity, organizational risk tolerance, things like that. I think that the differences in how you deploy resource demand capacity planning is within the execution based on all those factors. And finally, I think you need to be able to adapt and scale, be ready to evolve and engage your sponsors throughout. I'm certain that the resource management needs of the organization a year from now are going to be much different from the ones that I have today, but it's always a balance as you want to evolve, and but you also need the stability to not be so fluid that you continually switch gears and never give yourself and your stakeholders something to build on. So with that, I can wrap it up there and leave a few minutes for questions.
Perfect. This was excellent, Tony. This was very, very excellent. And I know that everyone loves hearing case studies because it really is nothing theoretical about it, but you're just bringing a very real value to attendees, to professionals who do want to maybe do the same. So I'm sure this was very, very exciting for everyone to hear. As you said, exactly their questions. So we've got a lovely comment Organon is so excited to hear about. So thank you. Chris Prack, is global time tracking for HR or for project management to analyze planned versus actual hours against project deliverables, phases, etc.? So what would you say?
Yeah, so it's not for human resource, and it's not necessarily for project management. It's for, time tracking. I've done whole presentations just on our time tracking approach, but where we landed was we track at a product level and a functional level, meaning the way that we use it is we take a look and we say, how much effort does this product take? And how much does it take to support this product versus maybe that product, or this activity versus that activity? And where it comes into play of estimates versus actuals is we do have some of those algorithms that we build. And so we periodically will go back and say, you say that you need 2 for this type of work, but I only see a half of an FTE working their time against it. So it's, the estimates versus actuals is one of the driving factors of it, as well as sharing with, what's our utilization? Do we have hotspots either functionally or geographically that are going to need additional resources as we go down the road?
Perfect. Thank you. Actually, Corky agrees. He says, good question, Chris. Time tracking is a tricky business, so he probably isn't the only one. We've got a question, a comment from Cami. It is important to speak to leaders to understand the resource demand. However, the reality is that some are better at the discussion versus the others. How did you bridge the gap between some of the assumptions that were not realistic? And also, did you use Merck historical data as analogs or use any other industry averages?
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first. So when we were establishing some of those baseline models, we did use some Merck historical data as analogs, as much as we could, understanding that they came with a lot of caveats, because again, a different model, different everything. But we did, for lack of anything else, we did use some Merck historical data. The first one goes to some of that. The first part of that question goes to a lot of the psychological safety, I think, that we've all dealt with, because you're spot on in terms of, Cami is spot on in terms of, it isn't always easy to there's a bit of nitty gritty to resource management where you have to define what an FTE is and how much time does a person actually have to work throughout the year, and how do you quantify that and how do you represent that? And so it does take time with them. And what I found is a lot of times you do have to gauge your audience a bit, and some of them maybe need a little bit more hand holding, and maybe you do it in steps and give them, I can think of one particular stakeholder that was challenging, where I would, as a build over time, and we would meet 1 month and I would say, hey, these are some of the basic concepts that I'm talking about, and try to get that established. And then we go to the next month and say, okay, remember that we talked about those basics, and now here's how we might talk about resources and how that applies, and kind of building them and bringing them along. Whereas others, it's such a pleasure when they kind of get it from the get-go and you can kind of get into the meat of the conversation, but again, that's I think a big part of this is understanding your stakeholders.
Perfect. These were very wonderful questions. We're just going to take the last one before our panel discussion, actually, a teaser. From Corky, did you use an algorithmic approach to generate estimates for each job category?
Yes. And I mean, but to be clear, algorithm is probably a loose term. I mean, like I said, these were very rudimentary. We would take values and say, we had a list of probably 20 to 30 different functions across our research and development and had values for each of them, but they were only at like 4 basic time points where again, this is our starting point. So we'd say implementation, development, filing and launch, and maintenance. And we had those 4 time points as kind of our guideposts to look at levels. And then when you take that across 20 to 30 or so functions and apply that to the deals, it comes out surprisingly accurate, where people feel comfortable that those are good estimates at this very early game.
Perfect. I think I even understand, actually. I'm catching up. We do have another question, but actually it's the top of the hour. And not to spoil anything, but we do have a panel discussion right now, and we're keeping Tony here. So please, Tony, stay with us.